Atlanta, Georgia, October 9th, 1844. Claraara Vance grabbed her own daughter by the hair, dragged her out of the slave quarters, and threw her into the dirt in front of every enslaved soul on Oak Haven. "On your knees," she hissed. "Let them all see what a traitor looks like." Then she turned to the overseer and said 4 words that would haunt this family for generations. "Bring me the whip." Her daughter was 22 years old. If this story moves you, subscribe, follow me to the very end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. There was a rule in the Vance household that everyone knew and no one dared speak aloud. You did not cross Claraara, not the enslaved people who cooked her meals, not the field hands who worked her land from the gray of dawn until the stars came out, and certainly not the men who occasionally came courting her daughter, Claraara, and then quietly disappeared from the social calendar without explanation. You simply did not cross her, and for 43 years of her life, no one had. Claraara Margaret Vance was not a woman who raised her voice. She had no need to. Her silence carried more weight than most men's shouting. She was tall, sharp-boned, with dark eyes that never softened, not even in church, not even at the graves of people she claimed to love. She moved through Oak Haven, her plantation house just outside the growing city of Atlanta, like a woman who had personally negotiated the terms of her own world and found them satisfactory. The house smelled of beeswax and dried lavender. The floors gleamed. The silver was polished every Tuesday. Order was everything to Claraara, because order was power, and she understood power the way other women understood prayer. She had built this life with intention. She had married well, outlived her husband without a single visible tear, managed the estate with a precision that made neighboring landowners quietly envious, and raised one daughter. One daughter who was supposed to be the living proof that Claraara had done everything right. That daughter was Claraara. Claraara Vance was 22 years old in the autumn of 1844, and she had her mother's cheekbones but none of her coldness. Where Claraara walked through a room and made the air tighten, Clara walked through a room and people exhaled. She laughed at things that weren't considered funny by polite society. She asked questions during supper that made guests shift uncomfortably in their chairs. She had a habit of going quiet in the middle of conversations, not from rudeness, but because something had occurred to her, something she was turning over in her mind, like a stone she'd found on a riverbank, wondering what lived beneath it. Claraara had spent years managing Claraara's peculiarities. That was the word she used. Peculiarities. As though her daughter's conscience were nothing more than a social inconvenience, a rough edge to be smoothed before the right man came along and made it all irrelevant. "You think too much," Claraara had told her more than once, setting her teacup down with a precise little click. "Women who think too much end up alone, Claraara. And women who end up alone end up pitied. Is that what you want? To be pitied?" Claraara never answered that question, not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer she had was not one her mother would survive hearing. What Claraara did not know, what she had not permitted herself to suspect, despite the signs that were quietly accumulating like leaves against a fence, was that her daughter had been living a secret life inside the walls of Oak Haven for nearly 8 months. It had started, as many things in Clara's life started, with a question. Moses was the one who asked it. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a scar along his left jaw from something that had happened long before he arrived at Oak Haven. Nobody talked about it, and he didn't offer. He had been at the plantation for 6 years, and in that time had become one of the most capable men on the property. He knew the land better than the overseer did. He could fix a wheel, patch a roof, read the weather and the way the horses held their ears. He did everything that was asked of him, and he did it without complaint, and Claraara considered him one of her more reliable investments, without ever once thinking of him as a man who might want something for himself. But Moses wanted something. It was a Thursday afternoon in early March when Clara found him standing near the fence post at the edge of the kitchen garden, holding a folded piece of paper between two fingers and staring at it the way a man stares at a door he knows is locked. "What is that?" she asked. He looked up, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he said very quietly, "Letter. They say it come for me. From my brother, down in Savannah." He paused. "I can't read it." Clara stood very still.
"Nobody here can read it," he said. "I asked Thomas to look at it, and he said the same thing. I've been carrying it 4 days. She looked at the paper in his hand. She looked at his face. And something moved in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. Something that felt like grief and fury wound together so tightly she couldn't separate them. "Give it to me," she said. She read him the letter that afternoon, standing in the kitchen garden with the early spring wind pulling at her skirts. It was from his brother, a man named Eli, who had managed somehow to get word through a free black preacher passing through Savannah. The letter said their mother had died in January. It said she had asked for Moses at the end. It said Eli didn't know when they would see each other again, but that he prayed for it. Moses did not cry. He stood very still and looked at the fence post and breathed. Then he said, "Thank you, Miss Vance." She did not sleep that night. By the following week, she had made a decision that she understood, even as she made it, could not be unmade. She would teach Moses to read. And she told no one, not a soul, not even the house girl she trusted most. She kept it inside her like a coal she'd swallowed, warm and dangerous. Moses came first. They met in the small room off the back of the grain storage, an hour after supper when the main house had settled into its nighttime quiet. Clara brought paper and a stub of pencil and a Bible, because the Bible was the one thing she could explain if anyone asked. She taught him letters the way she'd been taught them herself, methodically, patiently, one at a time. Moses learned fast, faster than she expected. He had been watching words his whole life from a distance. He just needed someone to let him in. Within 3 weeks, Cato had joined them. Cato was 26, wiry and watchful, with a quickness about him that made some of the white men at Oak Haven nervous in a way they couldn't quite articulate. He had grown up on a plantation in North Carolina before being sold twice over, ending up at Oak Haven the previous summer. He did not trust easily. But Moses had spoken to him, and Moses's word meant something in the quarters. So Cato came. Then Sam, then Elias, then Thomas. 5 men sitting in near darkness, bending over paper, tracing letters with fingers more accustomed to axe handles and plow grips. And Clara, sitting among them, not above them, not performing charity for her own comfort, but genuinely present, genuinely learning herself what it meant to be in a room where everyone wanted the same thing and was willing to risk everything to have it. She was happy in that room. It was the only place in her life where she felt completely awake. She knew the law. She had known it since she was 16 and overheard 2 men discussing it at one of her mother's dinner parties, laughing about it the way men laugh about laws they like because the laws protect something they own. Teaching enslaved people to read in the state of Georgia was a criminal offense, not a social infraction, not a peculiarity, a crime. The men in that room could be beaten, sold, separated from the small pieces of life they'd managed to hold on to, and she could be prosecuted. The Vance name could be dragged through courts and newspapers from Atlanta to Savannah. She knew all of this, and she kept coming back. For 8 months, they were not caught. For 8 months, the world Elilanena had so carefully constructed continued to function on its surface, gleaming and ordered,
while something entirely different lived in its foundations. And then came the evening of October the 9th. Elelena had gone to bed early with a headache, or so she'd told the house girl. But headaches had a way of clearing, and Elelena had a way of moving through her own house in near silence when it suited her, checking on things, verifying that the world was where she'd left it. It was a habit she had developed when her husband was still alive, and she suspected him of drinking in his study after midnight. Old habits did not die with the people that made them necessary. She saw the light under the door of the grain storage room. Just a thin line of it, barely visible, the kind of thing a person might ignore if they weren't looking. But Elelena was always looking. She put her hand on the door. She stood there for one full moment in the dark hallway, and something told her, some instinct she had no language for, that whatever was on the other side of that door was going to change everything. And she opened it anyway. What she saw was this. A daughter seated on an upturned crate, holding an open book in her lap, reading aloud in a low voice while 5 enslaved men sat around her, each with a piece of paper, each holding a pencil, each looking at the words on the page with an expression Elelena had never seen on a black face in her life and didn't know how to name, and was immediately, viscerally terrified by. Because it was the same expression she saw on her daughter's face when Claraara was learning something new. The same hunger, the same aliveness. The room went silent the moment the door opened. Clara looked up. Their eyes met, and in the space of one breath, 22 years of carefully managed mother and daughter came apart at the seams. "Mama," Clara said. Just that. Just the word, like a door closing. Elelena did not scream. She did not cry. She stood in the doorway and looked at her daughter and the 5 men around her, and the world she had built and maintained and defended with every ounce of her considerable will, tilted on its axis, and she felt it move, felt the ground shift under the perfect floors of Oakhaven, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that what she did in the next 5 minutes would determine whether anything of the Vance name survived at all. She reached out. She took the book from Clara's hands, she held it over the candle, and she let it burn. The book burned fast. Paper always does. Elelena stood in the doorway and watched the flames consume it, page by page, and she did not look at the 5 men in that room, not once, because to look at them would be to acknowledge them as witnesses, and she refused to give them even that. She looked only at Clara, and Clara looked back. Neither of them spoke. The candle hissed where the last corner of the cover fell into the flame and went dark. Then Elelena said very quietly, "Get up." Clara did not move immediately. She sat on that upturned crate with her spine straight and her chin level, and for 3 full seconds she held her mother's gaze without flinching, and that, more than the lessons, more than the paper, more than any of it, was what broke something loose inside Elelena's chest. Because defiance from a servant could be managed, defiance from your own blood was something else entirely. "I said get up, Clara." She stood. Moses had not moved. None of them had moved. They sat frozen in the particular stillness that enslaved people learned early, the stillness of men who know that any motion they make will be interpreted as threat. Cato's pencil was still in his hand. Thomas had a piece of paper on his knee with 7 letters on it, carefully formed. Elias was looking at the floor. Sam had his eyes closed. Moses was the only one looking at Elelena directly, and she could feel that look like a heat on her skin, even though she was refusing to see him. "Out," she said to Claraara, and pointed into the hallway. Claraara walked past her mother and out the door. Elelena followed. She pulled the door shut behind her, hard. In the hallway, with the dark pressing in around them, Elelena grabbed her daughter by the arm. Her grip was the kind that left marks. "Do you understand what you've done?" she whispered. Her voice was shaking now, not with grief, but with something Clara had never heard from her mother before. Fear. Raw animal fear. "Do you have any idea what they can do to this family? To this house? To you?" "I know the law," Clara said. "Then why?" The question came out strangled. "Why would you do this? For what? For them?" Clara pulled her arm free.
Moses got a letter from his brother in March. His mother had died, and he couldn't read it. He carried it for 4 days before he asked me. She said it plainly, like a fact, like the answer was obvious. "That's why." Elelena stared at her daughter for a long moment. Then she slapped her. Open hand, hard across the left cheek, the crack of it sharp in the dark hallway. Claraara's head turned with the force of it. She did not cry. She turned back slowly and looked at her mother with an expression that was somehow worse than tears. It was pity. That pity was the thing that undid Elelena entirely. She had managed anger. She had survived disrespect. She had outlasted grief and loneliness and the quiet humiliation of a husband who drank and made poor investments and left her to salvage what dignity she could from a marriage she had endured for 20 years. She had managed all of it through will and pride and the rigid certainty that she was right about how the world worked. But her daughter looking at her with pity, her daughter standing in the hallway of Oak Haven with a red mark rising on her face, and feeling sorry for the woman who'd put it there. That was beyond managing. "Go to your room," Elelena said. "Don't speak to anyone. Don't leave. I will deal with you in the morning." Claraara walked away without a word. Elelena stood alone in the hallway for a long time. Then she went to find the overseer. His name was Garrett Hobbs, and he had worked Oak Haven for 11 years. He was a compact, weathered man with small eyes and the particular manner of someone who had learned to be useful to powerful people without ever becoming their equal. He understood his role precisely. When Elelena knocked on the door of his quarters at 10:30 in the evening, he opened it immediately, as though he'd been waiting, and he listened to what she said without expression. When she finished, he said, "All 5 of them, Mrs. Vance?" "All 5, she said. "And I want everyone from the quarters assembled by first light, every single person." He nodded once. That was enough. Elelena went back to the main house and sat in her husband's old chair in the study and did not sleep. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and thought about what she was going to do with the morning. And she was methodical about it, the way she was methodical about everything. She thought about the neighbors. She thought about the church. She thought about the men who sat on the county court, who had known her family for 3 generations. She thought about what the punishment needed to accomplish. It needed to be witnessed. It needed to be complete. It needed to leave no room for anyone to question whether Elelena Vance was in control of her household. She did not once think about Claraara's face in the hallway. She would not permit herself to. Dawn came gray and cold. October in Georgia had a particular quality to its early mornings, a raw dampness that settled into the bones. By the time the light was strong enough to see clearly, Garrett Hobbs had done what he was told. Every man, woman, and child from the quarters was standing in the open ground between the grain storage and the main house, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. 41 people. Some of them had children at their sides. An older woman in the back was holding a baby wrapped in cloth. Moses, Cato, Sam, Elias, and Thomas stood separately from the rest, brought forward by Hobbs and positioned so that everyone could see them. Their hands were bound. None of them spoke. Moses was looking straight ahead at something that wasn't there, his jaw set in a way that made him look older than his years. When Elelena came out of the main house, she had Claraara with her. She was holding her daughter by the upper arm, walking her forward like property, like something she owned and was displaying. Clara was wearing the same dress from the night before.
Her hair was loose. The mark on her face had darkened overnight. She did not struggle. She walked. Elena stopped in the middle of the assembled crowd and turned to face them all. Her voice, when she spoke, was completely steady.
"Last night," she said, "my daughter broke the law of this state and betrayed the trust of this household." She paused, and in that pause the only sound was the wind and the distant noise of the horses shifting in the stable. "She has been meeting secretly with these 5 men and teaching them to read. She believed she could do this in my house, on my land, without consequence." Another pause. She was wrong. Clara was standing very still. She was looking at Moses. He was not looking back at her. He was staring at the ground now, his bound hands loose at his waist, and something about the way he held himself suggested he was trying very hard to be invisible, to take up no space, to give Elena nothing extra to use. "Turn to face them," Elena said to Claraara. Claraara turned. "You are going to stand here," Elena said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And you are going to watch. You will not look away. You will not speak. You will stand and you will understand what your choices have cost." What happened in the next 20 minutes was the kind of thing that people who witnessed it never described in specific terms afterward, not because they had forgotten, but because some things settle so deep into the body that the only way to survive them is to refuse to give them language. The 5 men received the overseer's punishment in front of everyone they knew, in front of children who hid their faces in their mothers' skirts, in front of women who looked at the ground and pressed their lips together until the sound was over. Claraara watched all of it. She did not look away. That was the choice she made, the only choice she had left. If she was going to be forced to stand there, she was going to bear witness properly. She was going to see every second of what her mother was doing, and she was going to remember it. Every sound, every face. She was going to carry it. When it was over, when Hobbs stepped back, Elena turned to the assembled crowd and said, in the same steady voice, "Go back to your work." They dispersed, quietly, quickly. The baby in the old woman's arms had been crying, but even the baby had gone quiet now, as though the air itself was too heavy for sound. Moses was the last one moved. As Hobbs led him away, he turned his head once, briefly, in Clara's direction. Not to look at her. She understood that. He couldn't afford to look at her. He turned his head in a way that might have been random, that no one watching could interpret as anything directed, and yet Clara understood it as clearly as if he had spoken. "I am still here. We are still here. You did not break us." She pressed her fingernails into her palms until she felt the sharp edge of it. Elena came to stand beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elena said, "You will not leave this property without my permission. You will not go near the quarters. You will not speak to any of them, not now, not ever again." She straightened her shawl. "And tomorrow, you will be pleasant at breakfast, and when Reverend Moore comes to call on Thursday, you will sit in the parlor and you will smile, and you will be exactly who I raised you to be." Clara turned to look at her mother. "Who did you raise me to be?" she asked. The question was not angry, it was genuine. That was what made Elena take a half step back without realizing she'd done it. "A Vance," she said. "A woman with sense and standing, and a future worth having." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "You just had 5 men beaten in front of their children to protect a name. Do you understand that? A name." She shook her head. "I don't want the future you're building for me, Mama. I never did." She walked back to the main house alone.
Elelena stood in the cold morning air and listened to the sound of her daughter's footsteps on the wooden stairs. She stood there until she couldn't hear them anymore, and then she stood there a little longer, in the silence, in the gray October light, with the Vance name wrapped around her like chains she had spent her whole life calling jewelry. Something had shifted.
She could feel it, the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds come. Something had moved in the foundation of this house that no amount of polish or order or social management was going to put back. She had done what she believed needed to be done. She had done it cleanly and completely, and in full view of everyone who needed to see it. And standing there in the aftermath, with the cold air on her face and the sound of the plantation returning slowly to its daylight rhythms, Elelena Vance felt, for the first time in 43 years, genuinely afraid of herself. 3 days passed. 3 days of breakfast eaten in silence, of silverware placed down carefully, of Elelena sitting at the head of the table and Claraara sitting at the other end, and neither of them speaking unless the house girl asked a question that required an answer. 3 days of the plantation pretending to be normal, while something underneath it festered like an untreated wound. On the morning of the 4th day, Reverend Moore came to call. He was a soft-spoken man, Moore, with pink hands and the habit of pressing them together when he talked about God, as though he were trying to hold something slippery. He had known the Vance family for 15 years. He had said words over Elelena's husband's grave. He accepted her donations to the church without embarrassing either of them by making too much of the amounts. He understood, in other words, what his role was in the social architecture of this county, and he played it with practiced grace. He sat in the parlor and took his tea and talked about the weather and the harvest and a visiting minister coming down from Charleston, and Elelena sat across from him with her hands folded and smiled at everything he said. Claraara sat in the chair by the window. She had said good morning when he arrived. She had accepted her tea. She had done exactly what her mother asked her to do. Until Moore said, in that casual way men said things they considered inconsequential, "I heard there was some trouble out here last week. Hobbs mentioned it to my deacon in town." The room stopped. Elelena's smile did not move. "Minor household matter," she said, "fully resolved." Moore nodded, still pressing his hands together. Of course. I only mention it because, well, you know how people talk. And with the county elections coming, some of the men on the court have been particularly attentive to, shall we say, irregularities in household management." He was not looking at Clara. He was being very careful not to look at Clara, which meant he was looking at Clara. "There are no irregularities at Oakhaven," Elelena said. Her voice had the texture of polished stone. "I can assure you of that, Reverend." "Of course," he said again. He set his teacup down. "And your daughter? Clara, you're looking well." Clara looked at him directly. "Thank you, Reverend Moore." "Any thoughts of the upcoming social season? There are several fine young men whose families have expressed—" "I'm not interested in the social season," Clara said. The silence that followed that sentence had a particular quality. It was the silence of a room in which something small but irreversible had just broken. Elelena laughed lightly, the way a woman laughs when she is performing composure for an audience. "She's being modest," she said. "We've been discussing several introductions. Nothing confirmed yet." Moore left 20 minutes later with a tin of butter cookies from the kitchen and the satisfied expression of a man who had completed his errand. Elelena walked him to the door and stood on the porch until his carriage was out of sight. Then she came back inside and closed the parlor door behind her. "That man," she said, still facing the door, "knows something or suspects something, which means someone talked." Clara said nothing. Elelena turned. "Who did you tell before I found you? Did you tell anyone in this house what you were doing?" "No?
Not the girl? Not anyone in the kitchen? No one, Clara said. I told no one. Elena studied her for a long moment. Then Hobbs talked, or one of the men talked. She pressed 2 fingers against her temple. Either way, it's out. And if it reaches the court before I manage it, this family loses everything. The land, the house, everything your father left. She said it the way she said most difficult things, as a series of facts arranged in order of their practical consequence, with the emotional reality buried so deep beneath the structure that it barely registered. Claraara stood up. I want to see them. Absolutely not. I need to know they're alive, Clara said. I need to know that what you did didn't... They are alive, Elena said sharply. They are working. That is all you need to know. That is not all I need to know. Clara's voice did not rise. That was the thing about her that Elena found most destabilizing. She didn't shout. She just held her ground the way water holds its level, quietly, completely, without apology. Moses, Cato, Sam, Elias, Thomas, 5 men with names. I need to know they are not badly hurt. I need to know that. Elena looked at her daughter for a long time. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite an expression, more like the shadow of one. Then she said, They are able to work. That is all I will tell you. She walked out of the parlor. Claraara sat back down in the chair by the window and pressed her hands flat against her knees and breathed. She had one plan. She had been constructing it for 3 days, quietly, carefully, the way she'd constructed the lessons, one piece at a time. She needed 2 things. She needed to know Moses was well enough to understand a message, and she needed to get a message to him without being seen. The house girl's name was Delia. She was 17 years old and had grown up at Oakhaven, born there the same year Clara was born, and they had spent their childhoods in the proximity that Southern households produced between white children and the enslaved children who served them, a proximity that looked like closeness from the outside and was something more complicated and more painful from within. Delia knew Clara. She knew her the way you know someone you have watched and served and never been permitted to fully know. That evening, when Delia brought the water for Clara's wash basin, Clara looked at her and said very quietly, I need you to do something for me. Delia put the basin down and said nothing. I need you to find out if Moses is able to walk. That's all. Just find out and tell me. Delia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Miss Clara, I got 3 children in those quarters. Clara looked at her. I know. If your mama finds out I carried anything between this house and those quarters... I know, Clara said again. I know what I'm asking you, and I understand if you say no. I mean that. Delia looked at her for a long time. Then she picked up the empty pitcher and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the doorframe. He walks, she said without turning around. All 5 of them walk. That's all I'm saying. She was gone before Clara could respond. The relief that moved through Clara's body was so sudden and so physical that she had to sit down on the edge of the bed. He walks. All 5 of them. She pressed her hand over her mouth and stayed there for a moment, just breathing, letting that piece of information settle into her bones where it could do its work. Then she started thinking about what came next. What came next arrived faster than she'd planned, and from a direction she hadn't anticipated. It was 2 nights later when Elena called her into the study. The hour was late, past 9, and the fire had been burning long enough that the room was warm in a way that felt almost uncomfortable. Elena was sitting behind the desk, and in front of her were 2 pieces of paper and a pen and an inkwell, arranged with the kind of precision that meant she had been sitting there for some time before summoning anyone. Claraara sat down across from her. I have made a decision, Elena said, and I want you to hear it fully before you respond. Claraara waited. There is a women's academy in Savannah.
It is well regarded and respectable, and it accepts young women of good family for extended residencies. Elelonena touched the edge of one of the papers.
I am going to tell people that you have gone there, for your education, for your refinement. That is what I will say. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. And where will I actually go? Elelonena did not answer that immediately. She straightened the paper in front of her. There is a family in Tennessee.
The Hargrove family, distant relatives of your father's. They have a farm, modest but respectable. You will go there and you will stay there, quietly, until this situation has ceased to be a matter of discussion in this county.
Clara stared at her. You're sending me away.
I am protecting this family.
You're hiding me, Clara said, like I'm something that went wrong.
You did go wrong, Elelonena said, and the flatness in her voice was worse than cruelty because it sounded like fact. You made choices that endangered every person on this property, including those 5 men you claim to care about so much. If this reaches the county court, do you know what happens to them? They get sold, separately, to different states. Is that what you want? Is that the outcome your rebellion produces? The words landed like stones. Claraara felt each one, because the thing about Elelonena was that she was not always wrong. She was wrong about everything that mattered, wrong about the humanity of the people she owned, wrong about the system she upheld, wrong about the world she was building. But she could take any situation and find the pressure point within it, the exact place where the argument hurt most, and she would press it without hesitation.
How long?
Clara asked.
As long as it takes.
That is not an answer. It is the only answer I have. Elelonena finally looked up from the papers. You will leave on Saturday, before dawn. Hobbs will take you to the road, and there will be a carriage. Does anyone know the real reason? No, and they will not. Claraara sat very still. She was thinking about Delia's words. He walks. All 5 of them walk. She was thinking about Moses holding that letter for 4 days, not knowing what it said, carrying his grief in his hands like something he couldn't put down. She was thinking about Cato's face in the grain storage room the first night he came, how he sat down slowly, carefully, like a man who expected the offer to be taken back before he could fully accept it. She was thinking about Thomas, who had written those 7 careful letters on a piece of paper that now existed nowhere because her mother had made sure of that. She thought about all of it, and then she made her decision.
All right, she said.
Elelonena blinked. She had expected more resistance. The speed of the agreement made her cautious.
All right?
I'll go Saturday, Clara said, before dawn. Elelonena studied her for a long moment, the way she studied everything, looking for the fault line, the place where the surface disagreed with what was underneath. She found nothing in Claraara's expression that she could name, and that bothered her more than argument would have. You may go to bed, she said finally. Claraara stood. She walked to the door. She had her hand on the frame, in the same place Delia had stood 2 nights before, and she paused. She turned back to look at her mother, sitting behind that desk in the firelight, with her papers and her pen and her absolute certainty that she controlled the shape of things.
Mama, she said, did you ever love this place? Or did you only ever own it? Elelonena said nothing. Claraara walked out and closed the door quietly behind her. In the study, Elelonena sat alone with the fire and the papers and the question her daughter had left hanging in the air.
She did not answer it, not out loud, not even to herself. She picked up the pen. She began to write the letter to the Hargrove family in Tennessee. Her handwriting was perfect, as it always was, controlled, precise. Every letter formed exactly as it should be.
Outside, the October wind moved through Oakhaven and rattled the shutters, and somewhere in the quarters, a child was crying, and the sound carried in the cold night air all the way to the study window, and Ella Lenina kept writing.
Saturday came the way Clara had known it would. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, the way reckoning always comes, sudden and complete, and already too late to prepare for. She had not slept. She had lain on top of the bed covers fully dressed since midnight, staring at the ceiling and listening to Oakhaven breathe. Old houses have their own sounds, their own rhythms, the way the wood expands and contracts in the cold, the way certain floorboards speak when the temperature drops, the particular silence of a place that holds too many secrets in its walls. She had grown up inside those sounds. She knew every one of them, and she understood, lying there in the dark, that she was listening to them the way you listen to something you are about to lose. She had made a decision, not the one she had told her mother she'd made, a different one, the real one, the one she had been quietly building since the moment Delia stood in her doorway and said, "He walks without turning around." At 3:30 in the morning, Clara sat up, put her feet on the floor, and reached under the mattress for the two things she had placed there 3 days ago. The first was a folded piece of paper. The second was a stub of pencil, the same one she had brought to the grain storage room on the very first night, kept in her pocket these 8 months like a talisman. She held them both in her hands in the dark, and thought about Moses holding his brother's letter by the fence post in March. She thought about how long 4 days was when you were carrying grief you couldn't read. Then she wrote, quickly, in the dark, by feel more than sight. She did not write much. There was no need for much. She wrote 3 sentences, folded the paper twice, and pressed it flat. She stood up. She picked up the small bag she had packed 2 days earlier, nothing of value inside it, just what she needed and nothing she would be expected to miss. She opened her bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The house was completely quiet. She did not go toward the front. She went toward the back, toward the kitchen passage that ran along the east side of the house, the passage she had used for 8 months to reach the grain storage without being seen from the main windows. Her feet knew every board, every soft spot, every place to step and where not to. She moved without sound. At the end of the kitchen passage, she stopped. Delia was standing there. Not waiting, exactly. Standing. With her arms folded across her chest, and her expression carrying everything she could not say out loud in a house where walls had ears and consequences were real and permanent and paid for in flesh. Clara looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Clara held out the folded paper. "Give this to Moses," she said, "when it's safe, when Hobbs isn't near. You choose the moment. You know how to do that better than I do." Delia looked at the paper. She did not take it immediately. She looked at it the way you look at something you know is going to cost you before you decide whether the cost is worth paying. "What does it say?" she asked. "It tells him where the letters are," Clara said. "The alphabet, the sounds, everything I taught them, written down and hidden in the grain storage, behind the third beam from the left, wrapped in cloth. If they find it, they can keep going. Without me." Delia was quiet for a long moment. Then she took the paper, folded it smaller, and pressed it inside the front of her dress without a word. That was all. No promise, no agreement, no ceremony. Just the decision, made simply, in the dark, by a woman with 3 children and everything to lose, and the particular courage of people who have already had everything taken from them once and know they can survive it. Clara reached out and touched her hand, just briefly, just for a second. Delia did not pull away. Then Clara walked out the back door into the October dark. Hobbs was waiting by the road with the carriage, exactly as Ella Lenina had arranged. He did not speak to her. He did not look at her directly.
He held the carriage door open, and she got in, and he climbed to the driver's seat, and they moved down the Oakhaven road in the gray pre-dawn, the horses' hooves on the packed dirt, the only sound. Clara looked back once. The main house was dark, every window dark. She looked at it for as long as she could see it, and then the road curved, and the trees took it, and Oakhaven was gone. Hobbs had been told to take her to the Junction Road, where a hired carriage would be waiting to carry her north toward Tennessee. That was the plan. That was what Ellenina had arranged and paid for, and believed would happen. At the junction, there were two roads. Hobbs pulled the horses to a stop. He climbed down and opened the carriage door and stood back. He was looking at the ground, the way he looked at the ground when he wanted to be certain no one could read his expression. Clara stepped down. She looked at both roads. The hired carriage was there, waiting, pointed north toward Tennessee and the Hargrove farm, and the quiet, managed disappearance her mother had designed for her. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "Hobbs." He looked up. "The carriage my mother hired. Is the driver paid already?" Hobbs hesitated. "Yes, ma'am." "Then he doesn't need me specifically," she said. "He just needs to complete a trip." Hobbs looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face that she had never seen there before. Not sympathy exactly. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who has spent 11 years being useful to a powerful woman and has, in the privacy of his own mind, kept a careful accounting of everything he has witnessed and done and been complicit in, and who is, in this moment, being offered the very small mercy of doing nothing. He looked back at the ground. "I need to return to Oakhaven before sunup," he said. "I don't see much in this dark." He climbed back onto the seat and turned the horses without another word, and the carriage moved back down the road toward Oakhaven. And Claraara stood alone at the junction with her small bag and the dark and the two roads. She took the one going south. She walked until the sky began to lighten at its edges. She walked with her bag over one shoulder and her heart hammering in a way that felt like fear and felt like relief, and she could not separate the two, and decided she did not need to. She was 22 years old, and she had left everything behind, and she had no clear plan beyond the direction she was moving and the name of a free black church community in Savannah that a man named Eli had once mentioned in a letter that a woman named Clara had read aloud by a fence post on a cold March afternoon. She was going to find Eli, Moses' brother. She did not know if she could. She did not know what she would say if she did. But she had spent 8 months sitting in a room with 5 men who could have said the same thing about learning to read, that it was impossible, that the risk was too great, that the cost was too high. And they had come anyway, every single night. They had come, and they had put the pencil on the paper, and they had trusted that the letters would begin to make sense if they kept going long enough. She kept going. Back at Oakhaven, the sun came up over a house that did not yet know what had happened. Ellenina rose at 6, as she always did. She dressed. She came downstairs. She did not go to Clara's room, because she had said her goodbyes the night before in the only way she knew how, which was not to say them at all, which was to set a plate at the breakfast table as if her daughter were still there to use it, which was to fold her hands and sit down and pour her tea and tell herself that what she had done was necessary and right and the only choice available to a woman in her position. The house girl brought her toast. Ellenina said thank you. She looked at the empty chair at the other end of the table. At 7:30, Hobbs knocked on the study door and came in, holding his hat, and told her that the carriage at the junction had proceeded north as arranged, and that Miss Claraara had departed as planned. Ellenina thanked him. Hobbs left. She sat alone in the study with her tea and stared at the desk where she had written the letter to the Hargrove family 6 days ago. The letter with the perfect handwriting, every word controlled and precise. She thought about Clara saying, "Did you ever love this place, or did you only ever own it? She thought about the way her daughter had looked at her on that morning after the punishment, not with hatred, not even with anger, but with that quiet, devastating pity that Elelonena could not argue against, because you cannot argue against someone who has already seen through you completely. She did not cry.
Claraara Vance had not cried since her husband's funeral, and she had not cried then either. Not really, not the way grief is supposed to move through a person and clean something out. She had held it all inside, the way she held everything, pressed down and managed and arranged into order. And the result was a woman who was impeccable on the surface and hollowed clean through by the middle. She picked up her pen. There were accounts to review. There were letters to write. There was the county social committee that needed a response by Friday, and the harvest tallies that Hobbs would need to go over by end of week. There was always something. The machinery of Oak Haven required constant tending, and Elelonena had always tended it, and she would continue to tend it because that was what she understood how to do. But her hand did not move. She sat there with the pen above the paper and the October sun coming through the window and the house quiet around her. That particular quality of quiet that is not peaceful but empty. And she thought about Moses in the grain storage room, his finger tracing letters on a piece of paper, that expression on his face that she had not been able to name and could not stop seeing. She thought about Cato, about Thomas, about the 7 careful letters on a page that no longer existed, about 41 people standing in the cold morning air while she performed her authority for all of them, and what that performance had cost, what it had always cost, what the accounting of that cost would look like if anyone ever sat down and did it honestly. She thought about Claraara walking out the back door of this house in the dark. She put the pen down. Outside, the plantation moved through its morning rhythms, the sounds of work and motion that had always meant to her that everything was functioning, everything was in its right place. But she could hear it differently now that she had seen what was happening in the grain storage room, now that she knew what the faces of those 5 men looked like when they were learning, now that her daughter had stood in front of her and refused to be managed and walked away and left a question in the air that Elelonena could not answer and could not stop hearing. She would tell people Claraara was in Savannah. She would say the academy had been a wonderful opportunity. She would smile at Reverend Moore on Thursday, and she would manage the Vance name with all the skills she had spent her life developing. And from the outside, nothing at Oak Haven would look any different than it ever had. But Elelonena knew. In the way that a person knows something that has permanently rearranged itself inside them and cannot be put back. The system she had built her life inside, the system she had defended and enforced and taught her daughter to inhabit, had taken the only thing she had ever produced that mattered, the one living proof that something genuine had come from all that controlled and managed and carefully ordered life. And it had driven that thing away before dawn on a Saturday morning in October, down a road going south, towards something Elelonena would never be able to follow. She had won. Oak Haven was safe. The Vance name was intact. The county would hear nothing that would damage her standing. She had done everything a woman in her position was supposed to do. She picked up her teacup. She drank. She set it down. The house was perfect. The house was silent. The house was hers alone. And Claraara Vance walked south through the Georgia morning, carrying nothing but a pencil stub and the knowledge of what letters could do when you gave them to someone who had been waiting their whole life to hold them. And she did not look back again.